Hello everyone and welcome to PMA Australia and New Zealand's Technology and Innovation webinar entitled The Commercial Case of Vertical Farming. Today we're joined by the Agritech himself, Henry Gordon-Smith. Now this is the first Technology and Innovation webinar for 2019 and I would strongly encourage you to keep an eye out on the PMA ANZ website for upcoming future events. Now, during the course of this session, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A function in the box below. So without further ado, Henry, a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah, and big thanks to PMA for hosting this webinar. And of course, thank you to all of you for paying attention today and listening in. I'm Henry Gordon-Smith. I'm an urban agriculture consultant and I work all around the world. And I'm really excited to talk about the commercial case for vertical farming. So let's dive in here. On the agenda today, I'm going to go through a little bit of an introduction so you get to know me better. We're going to talk about what is vertical farming anyway, why vertical farming, why are people growing indoors with LED lights, what are some vertical farming types and case studies that we can learn from, and what about the ones that weren't successful. And we're going to talk about key economics, common mistakes and metrics to consider, and wrap up a little bit with a rapid consideration of how you can prepare yourself and your own commercial case for vertical farming, and some final thoughts to keep you motivated and excited and focused. So it's a lot to cover, so prepare for a dense webinar, but I'm really excited you're here, and thanks for your time and paying attention. So first of all, introduction, I grew up around the world. I was born in Hong Kong. I grew up in Tokyo, Germany, Czech Republic, Russia, Canada, and now the United States. So I really have a global outlook, and I think I've been able to apply that to agriculture. And also this living in big cities has really driven me to think about density, and I think what inspired me to kind of work in vertical farming. I do want to give a disclaimer though, that I'm not a horticulturalist, I'm not a plant scientist, I run a business and I understand the commercial case for vertical farming well, having been mentored by Dr. Dixon de Pommier, the author of The Vertical Farm, and also having consulted on about 74 different projects related to urban agriculture around the world. If you want to learn more about agritecture, you can check us out there and learn about the different projects we've done. It may inspire you to figure out your commercial case. So what is vertical farming? You know, vertical farming has a variety of definitions over time. Some have thought about it as skyscrapers like Dr. Dixon de Pommier. Some have said it can be kind of vertical greenhouses. Really, I think about it as three-dimensional farming. And typically it's done with hydroponic systems. It's done indoors to control the climate. And it's typically done using artificial lights as well, because as you stack, you have to replace sunlight. So let's look at some of the components of a vertical farm in a little while. First, let's get the context of vertical farming. You know, where does it fit in the overall spectrum of technology as it relates to local agriculture? So here's a simple spectrum of technology for you to think about. I hope this helps you frame your thinking when you look at different farms and think about the right farm for you. So on the low-tech side, we have kind of the typical community garden. You may be a member of one, you may see them around, and these provide, you know, food and also biodiversity. They manage water in the city. They create really interesting value. But they can't really grow year-round, and they are susceptible to pests. Unless you're in a warm climate, then you can grow year-round. But this one in New York, for example, shuts down in the winter. Moving on, we have rooftop farms, and typically these require a little bit more technology, engineered soil to make it lighter. Brooklyn Grange is a prime example of that. You can have hybrid models where you actually match technologies. Harlem Grown is a soil-based plot and a hydroponic greenhouse in Manhattan, and that way they can produce in the winter, but also have the benefits of the soil-based farm, which produces more diversity, it's a more open space, there's real value to soil-based agriculture that shouldn't be forgotten. Moving into the more high-tech methods, we've got hydroponic greenhouses. Again, hydroponics is where you use water instead of soil to deliver all of the nutrients and minerals the plant needs, and typically they're in recirculating systems. So here's a picture of an NFT, nutrient film technique, hydroponic system, and this is a 10,000 square foot greenhouse on top of a residential building in the Bronx. Quite an innovative and ambitious project. And it can grow year-round, right? Because it's indoors, it's a greenhouse. But let's say you've got bad weather, you've got clouds, you need to have a supplemental lighting. And so unless you're in a place with ideal temperatures year-round, even in greenhouses, you're gonna need to supplement that. And you're also susceptible to changes in the weather. Now on the ultimate control side, you've got vertical farming, and AeroFarms is one example of that. These are typically in warehouses, as I said, stacked levels of hydroponic agriculture, and they really are focused on ultimate control. But what's important to understand from looking at this is that there are trade-offs all along the spectrum. On the low-tech side, you get better biodiversity, you get better public interaction, you get better management of rainwater. and also lower cost to start the project. On the higher tech end, you get way more control, more consistency in the product. You can grow pesticide free. You can grow a lot more per square foot than you can on some of the other methods. And that allows you to grow in the city in ways that soil can be sometimes difficult to do. There's also trade-offs in costs, right? So here are some US-based back of the envelope costs that Agritecture Consulting uses when we're trying to advise clients on, should you build a vertical farm? Should you build a greenhouse? Should you build a soil-based farm? And so as you can see, on the soil-based side, you can develop a farm really quite inexpensively. And all that control that we get on the high-tech vertical farming side comes at a cost. So unless you have a really key value proposition for why your product is going to sell for more money, or your farm is a response to a specific gap in the market, it's going to be very difficult to recoup these high capital costs. So you can't really compete by just repeating the same thing that other farms are doing. You're going to need to be innovative. You're going to need to have a special brand, a new product, a new way of packaging, a new way of delivering, and not just the vertical farm itself. The innovation needed around vertical farming to justify that cost is quite significant. And so I've got 150 as a really low cost per square foot price for about 4 levels of cultivation. That's kind of the DIY no frills approach. But as you get better lights, we typically work with a $250 per square foot, US dollar per square foot minimum. So I guess you're looking at about $1,000 per square meter minimum for 4 levels of cultivation. If you go higher, that number can get even bigger. So again, there's trade-offs. Think about them and understand which approach is going to be best for you, your budget, your customer, your city, your climate, all of that. We're going to get more into those drivers later on. Again, when you think about your impact, you can also think about it in 4 categories. Aesthetic, you can think about your social impact. You can think about your economic impact from creating jobs or creating profit. And you can think about your environmental impact. I invite you to think about all of these as it relates to the previous spectrum as an exercise to understand those trade-offs. I think most vertical farmers are driven by the environmental impact of saving water and saving arable land, and the economic benefit of producing year-round product and selling that to buyers that may have difficulty getting a consistent product in the wintertime, for example. Aesthetic, sometimes it depends. Some of the farms are really visual, they're public, sometimes they're downtown, sometimes they're experiential. But I think most of the large-scale vertical farms, are closed boxes. You see the pictures on the internet, but you don't really get in there. Social impact, I think, again, vertical farms are commercial vertical farms in most cases. And so they're very much focused on maintaining a quality product. So you don't really want the public coming in and out of your farm. So that social impact typically happens through other ways. Hiring local staff that are maybe in areas that are lacking privilege and opportunity. You can see that in the Bronx. You can see that in New York, New Jersey with what AeroFarms is doing as an example. And there may be economic development opportunities and dollars there for creating jobs. So I just want you to frame your thinking and be more analytical when you look at different local farms and think about your commercial case. So let's use AeroFarms as an example to talk about the basic components of a vertical farm. And the first thing is the shell, right? So what are you going to contain your farm in? If you're a vertical farm just outside exposed to the environment, you're going to have similar problems to the soil-based approach with pests and changes in climate. So first you need to control that environment, create a shell. It could be a warehouse, it could be a new building, it could be an existing building. Some people are doing them in basements. Some people are doing them inside of grocery stores. Sometimes you can just create an enclosure within another space, containers. There's a lot of different options for your shell. You've got hydroponics. Now, AeroFarms uses aeroponics, which is a very precise method of hydroponics. You also have aquaponics, and you have different types of hydroponic methods. Either way, basically what you're trying to do is to reduce the weight per level and optimize the water and nutrients coming to the plant. And hydroponics can allow you to do that in a way that soil often doesn't. With that said, sometimes you can have soil-based systems and drip methods, and you do see more and more vertical farms considering that. Maybe they want to pursue organic certification. Maybe they have discovered a new kind of soil or a new soil mix that they can utilize. But either way, typically these systems are driving the nutrients and driving the oxygen that the roots of the plant need through hydroponic methods, meaning powered by water. Then you need your medium. Again, it could be soil, it could be coco coir, it could be a reusable clay pellets, it could be like a recycled material that AeroFarms uses or ZipGrow uses. So there's different substrates, and you can research that for ages, and we could have our own presentation on that. But that substrate's really important to create the structure for the roots and to support the plant. let's see, I've got my thing covered here. We've got LEDs. So again, when you're going indoors, you're stacking it, so you need some kind of lighting. And LEDs are really great because they are typically more powerful in the sense that they can provide, not powerful, they're more precise in the sense that you can control the spectrum and the wavelengths. So basically, without genetically engineering the plant, you can stimulate certain aspects of growth and you can encourage the plant to be successful by controlling that spectrum. When a plant is outdoors, it's getting the full spectrum of light, and that can be valuable, and even more and more lights indoors are doing that. But there are value propositions for certain crops to control the spectrum and to come up with your unique quote unquote recipe or approach to doing that. And LEDs give you that power. They're also lower in their power energy relative to some of the other lighting methods like fluorescent. They also create less heat, which is really important when you're stacking systems. So that's why you're seeing LEDs really explode and be a huge part of the vertical farming industry. There's other value propositions for LEDs as well. There's more research going into actually increasing the vitamin content in plants, which I think is a great future for vertical farming, creating superfoods. But I think also there's some research that I've witnessed or seen that is really talking about how the light itself can actually reduce pest outbreaks. So you can use light to kind of do a lot of the work that pesticides do, which is pretty amazing. Now we've got HVAC, so we've got to really control the heating and ventilation in the space. So in most large-scale vertical farms, your concern is going to be about getting the hot air out, because those lights, as they're very dense, they still do create a lot of heat. And so you want to create the right ideal microclimate in this area, right? You want to create the right conditions for the plant, and you want to create uniformity. So sometimes you'll see like small computer fans, you'll see different ventilation strategies. There's a lot of different approaches. My lesson here really, again, is that the common mistake that's being made is that people start with a small farm and they're like, oh, wow, everything's growing great. My HVAC is great. My economics are great. I'm going to build a huge farm now. When you're calculating your economics and your engineering, as you expand your farm and scale up, HVAC is probably the biggest mistake you're going to make. So you want to spend extra time there, because as you get more and more plants in the system, they evapotranspirate and they create new microclimates, new areas for humidity, new areas for disease that you really want to make sure that doesn't happen. I think that's a common issue when vertical farms scale up. And then you need the structure. This is basically what's going to support it. So you could do racks, you could do mobile racks like Montel does. You can do a variety of different options. You can do your own DIY racks, etc. I've seen some. We did one installation at a food bank. They didn't have a lot of money, so we just made it out of wood. So it really depends on what kind of farm you're doing, but you definitely need a structure to support and stack the farming systems. And those are really the basic components of an indoor vertical farm. Okay, and so also in your farm, sorry guys, having some issues with the clickers. Also in your farm, just from that last slide, you're gonna need to have your storage, your processing, all the other aspects of a regular farm. So let's look at the timeline of vertical farming. When we go to the story of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the story goes is that the city in the desert, King Nebuchadnezzar's wife wanted to basically green the city. And so they built this huge tower with hydroponic systems and gardens. And I think that's still a little bit of what we're trying to do today. If we look at most of the founders of vertical farming companies, they seem to have seen an opportunity in greening the city through vertical farming and saving water and kind of bringing that back. And I think that is part of what's driving this today. It's not only a business decision, there's a lot of emotion and wanting to make an impact that we see with a lot of the founders in this space. Now, hydroponics isn't that new. We can see some of the earliest drawings of vertical farms. NFT systems are a type of hydroponic farm. But if we really look at the latest phenomenon, it's since Dr. Dixon de Pommier published his book, The Vertical Farm. Even on Google Trends, you can see how the search results increased, for search queries increased for that. Now in the 2015 up to now, we're starting to see a lot more investment come into the space. Plenty recently raised over $200 million. AeroFarms is also has raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and the recent raise is listed there. And so we wonder what will be next coming onto the pipeline for vertical farming, but some of the key technologies that people are interested in are automation, AI, robotics, etc. And we can talk about why when we get into the economics. Let's just take a quick look at the venture capital activity coming into vertical farming. So as we can see, this is kind of the number of deals. And again, this is really when this site at least started to record them. And so we see a lot of fluctuation, but I think in general, we're seeing a consistent growth of the investment coming into vertical farming. There's a lot of interest in how this technology will help cities or help populations respond to a changing climate, and most of all, provide a consistent quality local product to customers. Excuse the sirens calling from Brooklyn here. So here's again another example of some of those investments. And I just want to say that with the exception of in-farm, I'm gonna mute for once. Sorry about that. With exception of in-farm and square roots, I'd say most of these, and maybe BIGH, most of these are what I would call large vertical farms. You know, these are 20,000, 30,000 square foot commercial vertical farms selling wholesale. You know, while in-farm and square roots are kind of more focused on the medium size, or maybe even the small size. They do more distributed farming, they have campuses, they basically provide a unique experience to the customer, while these other farms are mostly providing wholesale, or at least that's my interpretation of the models as I've seen them. And so a lot of the investment is coming into that larger scale operation, those 60,000, 100,000 square foot operations. And this recent $90 million raise by Bowery is similar in that sense. They're gonna build larger farms with that money. And so that really is important to understand. When you think about vertical farming, you think about, well, what am I capable of? Am I going to be able to raise this amount of money? Do I want to build a small one? There's ways to do it across every scale, but this is kind of where the money is going if you want to look at it that way. And when we think about revenue, this is, again, you look at the timeline, this is a very, very new industry. And again, this data is sourced from i3 Connect. This isn't my data. And so I can't speak to the exact accuracy of this, but this is a source for this investment information that's public. So let's look at this. A lot of them are pre-revenue, right? They're not necessarily, they're developing technologies, or they're conceiving how they're going to enter the market. And even then, those that have established, according to this site, the revenue isn't that significant. And so the lesson here is that this is still a new industry, which is exciting, because if you're a vertical farming pioneer, there's some really interesting opportunities for you. But I guess the caveat is you need to be really smart to be successful and understand how you're going to compete and how you're going to catch up with these bigger farms, if that's the scale you're interested in. So why vertical farming? Why are people going indoors and developing vertical farms? Oh, sorry, I just got a question on the chat. We'll keep going. So I think the key responses are to some of these challenges in traditional agriculture. And you've probably heard these, right? We're using tons of pesticide use on plants to keep the pests away. If we go indoors, we can solve that. There's no pesticide use needed in vertical farms. Typically, vertical farms will manage pests by excluding them because it's an indoor environment, but they also will use integrated pest management, meaning natural pest solutions instead of spraying. Excessive water use. We're using 70% of our fresh water on agriculture. Hydroponics and vertical farming can save 70 to 95% of that water as it recirculates it in the system. So it's a great response for places like the Middle East or even parts of Australia. Food miles, the distance for certain products is significant. And so vertical farming could provide a high volume of product close to the customer. That's one of the responses. That's why people are developing this. Food waste is another example. You know, we waste 40% of our food depending on where you are and depending on the product. But in leafy green category, we actually waste a lot more. Alina from AeroFarms recently at an event quoted 70% of leafy greens are wasted. And so it's lost on the value chain, but it's also lost in consumption. But I think if we produce a fresher product, at least the idea is if you produce a fresher product, deliver it closer to the customer, waste will be reduced. And also because you have less waste on the transportation aspects of the supply chain. And now we also have aging farmer issues. So we know that farmers are increasing in age, and we know that we've missed a whole generation in most countries, Australia included, in getting young people excited about agriculture. In contrast, vertical farming really gets young people like myself and others I meet all around the world excited about agriculture again. Maybe it's because we live in the Elon Musk era, but they're really looking at, you know, how can I take this technology? How can I get involved in it? How can I be a high-tech farmer? How can I do it closer to the city where my friends are? And I think that really excites them. And I guess overall, we have to really respond to climate change. And in some ways, you can think about vertical farming as growing year-round production and an adaptation strategy to climate change. Because no matter what the weather is outside, your product, your crops can continue to grow indoors consistently. So this is an interesting diagram that I work on, and you can build your own and think about the drivers for you. But on the left, we've kind of got some of the drivers for vertical farming. And on the top, we have some sample regions. And so if we look at the Middle East and Australia, when it comes to water scarcity, when it comes to concerns with food safety, when it comes to issues with arable land, in some places, not everywhere, Australia is a big, big country, unfavorable weather, the demand for local food seems to be increasing as well. And innovation leadership, right? PMA and other organizations are showing real leadership in getting ag tech and moving that forward. And then agricultural independence really relates to food security. So it's important to think about what are the drivers in your market that are going to make vertical farming successful. They're going to drive investment, are going to drive policy support, and are really going to create that demand from the customers. Let's get into some case studies. I've broken them up between small, distributed, medium, and large. And I'm going to go through these as quickly as I can. So looking at small, this is Farm One, Manhattan's first commercial vertical farm. Their first facility started only at 500 square feet. And they focus on growing a wide variety of rare culinary herbs. And they've done a really, really fantastic job at targeting high-end customers. So Michelin star restaurants are their main customer. As you can see here, it's all the things I described: the lights, the racks, the hydroponic systems. This is their second location where they expanded to, and they really focus on producing beautiful product, clean product, and for a high-end market. So when you're going for the small size vertical farm, the key takeaway here is you better be getting a really high margin and focusing on a premium product. It's going to be nearly impossible, or I would say impossible, to sell wholesale from a small farm that's only 500 to 1,500 square feet. So if you don't have a big budget, you need to really think about that direct-to-consumer or direct-to-restaurant model. Let's look at a distributed model. Smallhold is a really interesting vertical farming company that's actually growing mushrooms in vertical systems. And they essentially have a centralized location where they produce the mushrooms and distributed locations like this throughout supermarkets where the mushrooms grow. And so they kind of deliver it, and the product is already partly grown and it finishes growing there. That allows them to get the benefits of production in the early stages and make sure the product is high quality, but then also have the customer experience and the high value product that urban agriculture and vertical farming can provide. And they produce a beautiful product. They've been featured in Vogue, and they really are kind of leading a new trend of a new crop for vertical farming. And it's the only organic certified farm in New York City, which is pretty exciting. And there you go. This is their recent installation in Whole Foods. And so again, you can connect to the customer in ways that is very difficult for farmers outside of the city. You need to remember that when you think about urban agriculture and vertical farming as one of your key value propositions. Moving on to Square Roots, what I would call a medium-sized farm. They have 10 containers. Each of these containers are freight farm containers. And their model is unique in the sense that they began by recruiting entrepreneurs, one for each container, and allowing them to build their local food business. But now they've really expanded. You know, they sell to retail, they do delivery by bicycle, and they have amazing workshops where they bring the customers, or events where they bring the customers to their farms and they allow the customer to try product, and they partner with other brands. But again, this is a very urban project, right? So this is in Brooklyn, this is in a relatively expensive area, and so they need to attract the customers and really have a strong brand to get that price for these products. And they're growing mostly herbs and leafy greens and some microgreens. And you can see here, even in the wintertime, you know, these farms can be productive. Now, I have some concerns with container farms that we can talk about separately, in the sense you're trying to force a lot of equipment into a single operation. I think that increases the overall cost per pound, but it is valuable for a setup where you're looking to move quickly and establish your product and your customer quickly, because you can order it and plug it in, and with some reasonable amount of setup, you can get started. And this is the big one. You know, AeroFarms is one of the big vertical farms and one of the pioneers, and they've shown a lot of leadership in developing large-scale farms and selling to Whole Foods and Fresh Direct and a lot of big vendors. And they're focused on the wholesale market, and they sell mostly salad greens, baby greens, not microgreens. And they do it in really, really high racks, very significant capital cost, but huge potential to get to millions of pounds and provide a meaningful disruption to the greens that are supplied to New York City. And leafy greens typically come from California to New York City. So people might say, oh, they're just growing leafy greens. But this is a real disruption. This is a real identifiable market that they can grow this product locally, that they can create a new value proposition for the customer, and they can really transform that food system. And that fresher product is going to be more nutritionally dense because it's going to be fresher. It's going to taste better for the customer. And I think that's a really important value proposition. I think AeroFarms also does a really good job with food safety. They've made it a top priority. And as one of the drivers for vertical farming, it's important that as you go larger and you're getting those larger customers, that you focus on food safety from the very beginning. So it's not all sunshine and butterflies, as I said. There have been some large and medium and small scale vertical farms that have failed. Just briefly, Local Garden was the first commercial vertical farm to basically promote themselves. It was in Vancouver, Canada, and I think it was about 5, maybe 5.5 years ago. So it's still a really pretty new industry in North America. FarmTier was the largest vertical farm in the United States for a little while, and that went out of business, about 60,000 square feet. They had Whole Foods as a customer. They even were certified organic at a time. Podbonics was a series of containers that were stacked, about 100 containers that were stacked in Atlanta. And Verticulture was kind of more of a smaller aquaponic vertical farm in Brooklyn. Now, there's a whole video that I can send you, or we can share in the links afterwards, where we interview Podponics, Local Garden, and FarmTier about what went wrong. And I really, really recommend you watch it if you're interested in developing your own vertical farm. But bottom line, a lot of the issues relating to these focused on, my takeaway was that the understanding of the customer wasn't there. Some of the operations challenges weren't considered enough in the planning. And also that there was a lot of pivoting. What should we do next? What should we do next? And so I think piloting is a really important thing I'm gonna kind of get across to you all today. Moving into economics. So this is a sample model that I am able to share with you all. So this is a 14,000 square foot vertical farm, about $7.4 million USD. And you can see the payback, let's go to the ROI, about 7 to 8 years, okay? So although this is a very significant vertical farm, this does tell a picture. The message here is that vertical farming is not really quick money. It's very high capital intensive. And so if you're gonna build a big one, you're gonna need to raise significant amounts of money. And if you're going on the medium size, you may be able to reduce that ROI in some ways, but you risk kind of getting pushed out by a bigger farm. So the economics are improving, I can say that. I can say that we are doing more models nowadays that we can get to year 5, year 6 for even some of the bigger ones, but it really does depend on your market and how much your customer is gonna value your product. On the operations side, as you can see here, utilities split between HVAC and lighting is still a significant chunk. And again, this is an example, right? So this really does vary depending on where you are and all the cost drivers for that. Depreciation is a really significant cost I wanna make you aware of, especially on the lighting. One of the common mistakes I see that entrepreneurs make is they don't really consider the depreciation of their technology and the equipment. And so when they first do their model, they're like, wow, I'm making payback in year 5, that's great. But they haven't accounted for the fact that they may need to replace all of their lights in year 7. So you wanna be sure to understand the hours that your light performs, because that's a major capital cost, and you need to account for that in your depreciation of your operation. Labor continues to be a significant cost. Some operations, that goes up to 35% depending on where you are. And so you really, really want to be good at operations and managing your team and keeping your costs down. Those are some of the key recommendations I have for managing your vertical farming economics. Okay, I have to move quickly. So I did a quick review of Sydney. There's a really amazing site called Sydney Food Futures. And Sydney actually has some really interesting capabilities to produce its own local food. So about 20%, according to the site, is grown locally, which is really, I think, significant relative to most other cities. However, it's on a trajectory to lose about 60% of that by 2031. So as cities expand, they take up arable land. As cities expand, people move away from farmland and they move into the city and they're no longer interested in agriculture. This creates fragility and risk in the system. And so here are some metrics for that. That's the decline that we're seeing in local agriculture. And let's look at the crops. So obviously we're not gonna be really talking about dairy or meat here, but if we think about vegetables, you see a big gap there, right? Between now and 2031, there's gonna be a huge loss in the amount of vegetables grown locally for Sydney. Vertical farming could respond to that, or the leafy green categories, and actually start to supply some of those vegetables to make sure that decline doesn't happen as much. That could be your business opportunity. And so again, that opportunity, according to this scenario, I don't think they looked at vertical farming, but they did look at greenhouses, is that they could increase agriculture 8-fold and local agriculture 8-fold. And so I think, again, there's some opportunity for not only indoor vertical farms, but also greenhouses. And if you're interested in, maybe eggs, based on that past diagram. And so on their aggressive agriculture trajectory, even with the growth in population, they think that they can hit about 14% of local food supply. But again, I think if Sydney was smart about planning and how these high-tech indoor agriculture approaches could complement their planning, they could actually provide a lot of the fresh leafy green production close to the city. So here are some common mistakes that I want you to avoid. Miscalculated wastage. Do not assume that vertical farms don't produce waste. All farms produce waste. And so one thing we like to do is to think about, depending on what kind of farmer you are, and if you're a new farmer, if you're a new farmer, we typically start with about 30% waste in the beginning. So that really tells you might want to start with a smaller farm. And then you want to reduce that waste over time in your model when you're building your economic model. Miscalculated equipment depreciation. I already talked about that. Miscalculated labor. You want to design a 3D model of your space and think about each activity: seeding, cleaning, harvesting. All of this is going to drive your economics. So you need to understand your operation and how each labor is going to work. That's how we do it. Go big right away. Instead, you should pilot, especially if you're not going to go out and raise huge amounts of VC funding. You're going to need to pilot your farm. Your pilot could be anywhere from 500 to 2,000 square feet, depending on what your ultimate goal is. And it should really test out your labor assumptions. You should get crop to your customer. There's huge, huge value in piloting. My recommendation for your pilot is find a free space. Find a discounted space, find a basement, find a space that is something you're not paying top dollar for, so your money can go towards your technology and your labor. Don't overthink the engineering. Engineering and technology is only one part of this business, but also don't think about just having moving parts and mechanical systems. Local garden had too many moving parts and it creates new failure points. So try to simplify your engineering. Have a plan B. What that means is basically if you have a crop you think the market's gonna buy, make sure you have a backup crop to consider. And then data solves everything. You're gonna hear people saying, we sell plant recipes. You know, you can plug in this recipe and with our equipment, it's gonna grow. That's not really the case. I think the recipes really come from operating procedures combined with the right climate conditions needed for the plant. And so while those recipes might have some value, I think the word recipe kind of simplifies the whole thing. Instead, you need to think about this as an operations-focused business, and you need to make sure you can maintain a lean business and keep those costs down consistently, just like you would with any other farm. When you're thinking about your project or maybe your business plan or your operation, if you already have one going, these are some key metrics to consider. What's the capital cost per plant site, right? How much did you spend per plant that you're able to sell? What's your grams per kilowatt hour? That's your efficiency on your energy. And what's your unit cost? With any business like this, you want to know what's your margin? So how much does it cost for you to produce every product when all things are considered? Because that's your profit margin. That's what you have to consider to understand how your business is going to go. And so you really want to know before you grow, and these metrics are a great way to judge that. So preparing your commercial case, I'm going to have to go faster through this. We're going to get into some questions, so stick around. So just quickly, some of the key decisions you're going to want to make are relating to distribution and relating to your crop choice. And also if you want to be wholesale versus retail, which is a little bit like distribution. And also your positioning and your market size. How big is your market? Who's going to buy your product? What's your position in that market? I'm going to go through these a bit faster. If it loads. Okay, so think about it. What's urban agriculture really disrupting? It's disrupting distribution, right? Product is typically important to the city. You're providing that locally. And so you need to make sure that your value proposition is going to be different and compelling. And distribution is a really great first way to think about that. Now, this is the typical model, right? Farm to the city. And then we have some other models with vertical farming, which we explored. Okay, so we've got, sorry, it's loading a bit slowly. We've got kind of the smallhold model where it's in the store with the farm. In-farm also does something a little bit like that. We've got the farm, which is in the city, and it goes to the store and the customer. It's a little bit like square roots, you could say. And then you've kind of got the farm just near the city, like Aero Farms, where you get lower cost on the real estate, and then you're delivering to the store and you're still local. Those are some of the distribution models to think about. I want you to think about what crops would be good for you and your farm, and make sure there are some compelling problems. You want to look at demand, you want to look at scarcity, you want to look at quality of the product. These are some of the things that would help you drive your decision. And these are some of the things that you would want to account for. Selling price, is it labor intensive? Is there competition with the product? What's the yield per square foot? You want to build up your database to understand what's the best crop, what are the best crops for you to grow. Quickly on positioning. Branding is really important when it comes to local agriculture and getting investment. So you really want to think, again, on an axis where your brand fits as it relates to other brands, and say, I am the cleanest, I am the localist, we are the freshest, etc. What is your value proposition? And here's an exercise relating to that you can take with you, and you can see this in the review. We're almost there. So you can choose to work solo or with a team. You can think about some problems that exist in the market around food, and you think about a theoretical sum to invest. And then think about where your farm might be and start to think about how it relates to the other farms in the area. Think about your crops and try to answer the following phrase, right? We are the only vertical farm that sells X to these customers, solving the problem of consistency, ecology, whatever that is. And our market size is this. Once you can kind of come up with that quick exercise, you're ready to start planning your business. And so here's some final thoughts. It's really competitive out there. Agriculture is competitive. A lot of crops have become commodities. It's not an easy business. It's not a fast money business. It's not a low risk business. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means that you need to be aware of that and be smart about your fit. Also keep in mind scale, right? You don't want to compete with huge farms because that's going to be very difficult for you to do. So you really need to think about what's your unique product. Think about creating a new product or a new way to engage in the local product, because that massive scale is going to be very difficult to compete with. Also, mistakes get expensive fast. So make sure you pilot and make sure you think about those common mistakes to avoid. Also, don't think about this as a technology problem. If you want to be a technology company, build a small pilot, experiment with lights, experiment with robotics, whatever you want. But a lot of vertical farms can't decide if they're technology companies or farming companies. But if you're a farming company, you don't really have a technology problem. There's a lot of technologies out there. The costs are going down, the options are available, and that's not the problem you have. Instead, you have a marketing problem. Can you demand a higher price for your product? Can you convince the customer that your product is better than the competitors? And also you have an operations problem. Can you keep costs down? Can you maintain your labor costs? Can you really handle that operation consistently? So you need to think tough about who you are, what kind of business you want to run, and what kind of vertical farm is right for you. And only the smart will survive. And we've already seen that with some of the challenges and failures. So while we're seeing a lot of investment coming into the space, we've seen at least $40 million plus get lost. So I really want you to be responsible and think about your commercial case for vertical farming in your city in more detail. Just to wrap things up, I want to say thank you. I'm really excited for your questions today. If you want a free Know Before You Grow guide, this is kind of a step-by-step guide based on some of the things I've shared. You can shoot me an email and I'll send it to you, as well as some other kind of deals for some of the events we have coming up. I'm also going to be in Sydney speaking at the Indoor AgTech Summit on February 26th and 27th. And for those of you in Australia, I really love to hear from you. And next up, we're going to get into the questions.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for that, Henry. That was so much information, but really.
Yeah, sorry, it was dense.
No, don't apologize at all, because it definitely going to need a cup of tea after this, but it's very exciting and very exciting how it relates to the local context here in Sydney as well. So let's get going with some of these questions. So the first one that came through was through the chat function. The question is about what are the revenue sources of the vertical or urban farming from? So is it from the produce itself, or is it a combination of other elements such as the social ethical foundations of the product?
So I think if you're on the large side, it's just from the product, right? You're a farm, you're selling typically wholesale, and it's just from the product. You might get some money from partnerships, but primarily it's from the product. On the medium size, you can start to experiment with more of those experiential aspects, tours. But again, if you have a large scale farm, your focus should be production and selling a product. That's what you've invested in, that's what you should focus on. On the smallest scale, you see a lot more tours, you see a lot more classes, and I think this model has a lot more opportunity for flexibility, social impact, education, et cetera. And I think that's where you see that model and those activities.
Excellent. Wonderful. All right. Well, we've got a few more questions that we might be able to get through if you've got enough time. So the next is, is vertical farming feasible in a small city, so somewhere around 60,000 people in population, a city in which has a traditional agricultural influence?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, even if you have just traditional agriculture or even greenhouses, vertical farming has a role. There's some examples, including Shenandoah Growers, where their entire nursery is a vertical farm. And so that way they save space. And space does cost something anywhere, even if it's cheap. And so there may be a play for vertical farming to improve the quality of your product if you're a traditional farm or a greenhouse, and not necessarily grow all of your product in a vertical farmed way. I think for a small town, if you think about 60,000, it would have to be in a place where there's not a lot of availability of fresh leafy greens. And it's really interesting, some of the food deserts in the United States are actually around farming areas where they only grow soy and wheat, but they don't have a lot of greens. And I've even been to California near Fresno in the middle of orchards for oranges, and somebody had converted kind of a wet room, a washing room for their farm into a vertical farm, and they were profitable and they were running it well. It was one farmer, about 3,000 square feet, and I found that really impressive. So I think there's a play for it. Also, if you look at extreme climates, cities that are in more drought-ridden areas, or cities that are further north, especially if you look in Canada or even parts of Russia, I think there's definitely a play for vertical farming in those areas. I think it's going to be still a challenging business. You don't get the economies of scale for those bigger farms, but I think there's a play for vertical farming in almost any context. You just have to be creative about what that specific commercial case is.
Okay. Now, one of the other questions that's come through is about food safety. food safety in this space is largely ignored, is how this question is started. And these products aren't typically treated as ready to eat. So do you think there's enough focus on food safety in vertical and urban agriculture?
Yeah, I think that there hasn't been enough of a focus on a lot of the startup farmers. You know, they obviously don't have a lot of experience in agriculture in general. And so, you know, learning about the way to do a food safety plan and the importance of it it's just a complex topic, I think, for a lot of new entrepreneurs and new growers. So I think you see a lot of food safety risk at that scale. With that said, you know, they are indoors. They do typically wear gloves. There's no animals coming into the space. And so they do avoid a lot of the typical contaminants and sources that can affect, you know, food safety. Also, the traceability seems to be pretty good because they really know, you know, where everything is, because it's a smaller operation. It's not a mega operation. So their understanding of where the crops are. So there's a lot of value that already contributes to food safety from it being enclosed and protected. With a lot of the food safety scares we've seen in the US, it's kind of driven more attention to indoor agriculture as a solution to that. And I don't think that's exactly true. I think it really is an operation by operation basis. You shouldn't assume that a vertical farm has clean product all the time. But I do think that it has the potential to, especially in the leafy green category, to be a much more food safe product. And I think if you look at what AeroFarms and Plenty and Bright Farms are doing, they're collaborating actually, even though they're competitors, on food safety strategies for the industry to set new standards. Now they want to make it so that you as a customer value the bigger farms and the food safe farms over smaller startups. And there may be some concerns with that. But from a food safety perspective, I think that's a really good thing that that's what they're doing. And so I think we're seeing a lot of progress, a lot of focus on food safety. I think a lot of farms don't market it as ready to eat because they don't want to triple wash it. You know, triple washing has an additional cost and also has some additional food safety risks if you really look at it. And so I think a lot of the vertical farmers I work with and spoken to want to avoid that for cost reasons and also because they don't necessarily trust that entirely. So although they need to say, you know, wash before use often, and they should on the product, you know, there's typically no pesticides sprayed on it. It's typically grown indoors. And I think in general, it's a less risky product. But every single farm needs to have a food safety plan, indoor or not.
Excellent. All right. Now, there's a few other questions, but I think we've probably got time just for one more,
Okay.
which is, can you give an indicative cost in meters squared, if you can, of the initial investment from a small to a large scale setup?
Yeah, so meters squared.
Really challenging you now here with the...
Yeah, I don't have my conversion. Okay, I guess we work with 4 levels of cultivation. We typically do $250 per square foot, $270 per square foot for LED, 4 levels of cultivation for back of the envelope calculations. That's everything inside of the farm. That's not the retrofit for the building. That's the hydroponic systems, the lights, and even accounts for some of the HVAC. So, you know, I guess that gets you to about $1,000 a square meter if I'm doing that calculation correctly. And so that's for 4 levels, but obviously you see AeroFarms, some of these farms are growing higher. You don't always want to go that high. Keep in mind that if you go above 4 or 5 levels, you're going to need scissor lifts, and scissor lifts may actually really slow down your labor and increase your labor costs. So make sure you calculate that and think about that first. But bottom line, vertical farming is very expensive, $1 per square foot. And if you don't have the value proposition to sell consistent local product at a higher price, you're going to have a really tough time competing or maintaining your business.
Excellent. All right. Well, like I said, there's a few more questions, but we unfortunately have run out of time. Thank you so much for your time today, Henry. It's been absolutely wonderful hearing your insights. And I look forward to hearing you speak at the next engagement.
Yeah, thank you so much to PMA and everybody for listening in. I look forward to hearing your questions. If you want to follow up with me, I may take some time to answer, but I really, really do love to share knowledge about vertical farming and work with you if possible.